So we're going to get started in just a minute as soon as Maysay gets the slides up. This is our third campaign briefing session. We've had one on radioactive waste and one on clean energy and climate. At some point during this presentation, I'll ask Maysay to put the links to those presentations in the chat. So if you want to watch them, you can go back and take a look at those. Looks like maybe we just barely started the webinar. Do I need to repeat what I just said? Okay, cool. So I'm Scott Williams. I'm the Executive Director of HEAL. As part of this presentation today, we will have Noah Maturko, our Senior Policy Associate, Grace Olskamp, our Policy Associate, and Turner Bitton, our Development Director, will each be taking part. As I said, this is our third and final issue update session. This one is on air quality. We're going to be passing the baton a bit to talk about our things that we have been able to prioritize and focus on, the issues that we haven't been able to put as much time and energy into as we'd like to because of our limited capacity, and what we're trying to do to expand our capacity. So with that, Maysay, why don't you go to the next slide? Well, I forgot to mention our back-end support is Maysay Gonzalez. He's our new communications associate, and he'll be watching the chat and the Q&A and solving any technical problems that come up like he just did for me. So HEAL Utah is an organization that's about a little bit over 20 years old. We're a nonprofit and have been since 1999. We started with a group of citizens in Grantsville who were fighting the chemical weapons incineration and the health effects it was having in their community. Successfully got the Army to change that and have been going strong ever since. We have about 20,000 supporters who either donate money to us and or respond to our action alerts and or show up at the Capitol to lobby and or come to our events. So we've got a good base of support out in the community. People have been with us for a long time. We have a really great board of 10 board members. Our current board chair is Christy Clay, a professor at Westminster College. 7 staff members, and we're completely donor supported. So that's a brief summary of who we are. We work on 3 issues, primarily air quality, which we're going to be talking about today, energy and climate, and radioactive waste. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Maysay. So I'll hand it off to Grace.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And thanks for that quick introduction. So HEAL Utah, we started working on clean air issues in about the mid-2000s. We started as a particularly radioactive waste organization, but in the mid-2000s, we expanded and added clean air as we saw the threat that it was posing to public health, and that just continued to become increasingly clear. And one of the reasons for this is that there's an immediate and tangible impact of pollution on public health, especially to those with pre-existing conditions, children, and also the older population. The American Lung Association actually consistently ranks areas along the Wasatch Front as some of the worst places in the country for small particulate matter, which is known as PM2.5 and PM10 as well as a pollution called ozone. But the Uinta Basin also makes this list. It's not necessarily a list we want to be making for their ozone pollution. And these, according to the American Lung Associations, are noted as some of the most unhealthy places to live when it comes to air quality and health. And while ozone, which is a type of pollution you can't physically see, it essentially acts as a sunburn on your lungs. And the particles that make up PM2.5 pollution actually cause small lacerations on our lungs. And no matter the type of pollution, whether it's ozone or small particulate matter, exposure to it can create acute and chronic health conditions. And it raises the risk and even the intensity of problems like asthma, decreased lung function, heart attacks, and can lower resistances to things like diseases, colds, and pneumonia, And I'm sure in this last year, you may have seen some articles as well looking at the connections between poor air quality and actually more vulnerability to things like COVID. An interesting thing about air pollution too, and this is something that is one of the reasons HEAL started working on it, is that pollution doesn't really care what side of the aisle you sit on up at the Capitol. On bad air days, your children still have to stay inside from recess, and no matter how you vote on a bill, if you walk outside on a bad air day, you'll still feel those impacts. But while air pollution does affect us all, it's important to know that these effects are actually disproportionate throughout different regions and different communities. So historically, low income communities and predominantly communities of color will bear a greater burden of this pollution than higher income, predominantly white communities will. So sorry if my dogs start barking in the background. This is due to systemic issues such as redlining, and Utah really is no exception to this. So for example, if we look at Salt Lake City, the west side of the city is where most of the refineries are located and where a lot of the highways are crossing through. Not only does this part of the city have less green space and less access to good, reliable public transportation, but these communities often experience worse air quality than, say, the eastern part of Salt Lake City. So this is just one of the many examples of environmental justice and injustices when it comes to issues like air quality, and is one of the reasons that HEAL has been working on it and will continue to work on it for the years to come. And you can go to the next slide, may say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Grace. That was really thorough. I'll try to build on it a little bit without overlapping too much. So as Grace mentioned, one of the most visible effects of wintertime pollutions occur in pictures just like this. That's our wintertime inversion events, which are kind of the hallmark for northern Utah air pollution, and a really striking and visible reminder of what's at risk during these air pollution days. So just the quick science lesson, inversion itself doesn't mean that there's pollution necessarily in the air. If you've been around the Rocky Mountain West, inversion is a weather phenomenon that can take place generally in mountain valleys where the cold air sinks and then the warm air is trapped on top. And that's what we get here on our valleys in the Wasatch Front, and everything's basically trapped in there. So when you see days like this, where there's visible gray and brown smog that gets trapped in the valleys, that decreases the visibility, and it's also unhealthy for humans, like Grace mentioned. It's unhealthy for wildlife in similar ways, and all of these pollutions, much of these criteria pollutants that make up our PM 2.5 and ozone are also greenhouse gas emissions, so contribute to climate change. So poor air quality creates both acute and chronic health concerns, and exposure to pollution raises the risk and intensity of problems like asthma, decreased lung function, heart attacks, and can lower resistance to disease, all of which Grace had touched on. And if you've been in Utah long enough, you've probably known families that have moved out of Utah due to the air quality problems and the risks for children and elderly family members. So this touches on not only the public health impact of these poor air quality events, but also gives an idea of what we're facing for economic health. We know that people stay home from work on days where they're impacted by air quality if they're feeling sick, that there's productivity loss, that there are folks who won't move to Utah or will move away from Utah. It can't be a part of a productive economy due to the very real concerns on this air pollution. And as Grace mentioned, air pollution disproportionately impacts the health of communities throughout Utah due to our unique geography and socioeconomic factors. So communities living on the west side, where there's freeways and major industrial sources are located, tend to have greater exposure to pollution than communities on the east side, though that's not always the case. And I feel like we have a pretty good wrap on what's going on here, so I think we can jump ahead to the next slide.
Great, thanks, Noah. So that kind of lays the groundwork for why HEAL works on this issue. It's really important to help. It's also important to the economy of the state. There's businesses that choose not to locate in this area because of the air quality. And it also has costs in terms of our healthcare costs. So the biggest center ring of this circus right now for air quality work is the inland port. The inland port, it's hard to imagine that any of you watching don't already know what this is. It's a plan to develop the northwest quadrant of the Salt Lake Valley to be a logistics hub, justified by the fact that there are two freeways, I-80, I-15, and actually a third 215, rail lines, and an airport that all sort of exist in a very small area. Second justification is that more and more we're all ordering our consumer goods online, and those are being transported to us and need to go have a transport system that allows that to happen. And all that being said, we shouldn't have to choose between having the goods that we need to live our lives or jobs that might be created and clean air. So that's a false choice that HEAL does not believe should be presented to the public. And there are many groups that are trying to get the port to stop the building of the port. Nothing would make HEAL happier than if that were to happen. Our concern is that this is land that is privately owned and could be developed with or without this inland port plan. There's already a significant amount of land in this area that has been developed into warehouse and manufacturing. There's a lot of powerful political interests behind developing this port. And so the role that HEAL decided to play is what we would call an environmental backstop. We would love it if the port was not built, but if it does go forward, we want to make sure that there are really strong environmental controls in how it develops. And so what we've been doing is researching best practices around the world. One of those is that in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, called San Pedro Bay, they've been able through regulation to reduce the diesel emissions from truck traffic in and out of their ports by 90 to 95% by requiring trucks to have engines that are the lowest polluting types of diesel engines made. There are other ports around the world that have done other things in terms of air quality emissions. The port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands is considered to be a model for this. So we've been trying to review the plans for the inland port and see if those kinds of best practices are being incorporated. When the port released its business plan last year, HEAL submitted 8 pages of comments about how that business plan needed to be strengthened in order to make sure that the environmental controls were in place. Almost none of our recommendations were included in the business plan. And so we're now at a point where we feel like we need to become more aggressive about this. And while other groups are still trying to get the port stopped through various mechanisms, what HEAL is doing now is we're pointing out to the legislature and others that even as far along as this port planning process has gotten, there are no adopted air quality measures, there's no measurable air quality goals, and there's no point of accountability for performance in reducing or at least not increasing air pollution in the area. So HEAL is going to be working on this continuously. It's high on our priority list. And we'd be glad to talk to any of our supporters about this, provide more information. We just want to make sure that it's well understood that HEAL is doing everything we think we can to try to make sure that if the port gets developed, it is accountable to not worsen our air. And if it can't provide that kind of planning and assurance, that it needs to be slowed down and not built until it can. So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide.
Thanks, Scott. So another one of our really large current priority areas is vehicle emissions, which has a couple different aspects to it. And while building emissions are on the rise right now, and those are projected, as well as other what's called area sources, to surpass the other emitters, vehicles, sorry about my dogs in the background, have been the primary pollutant in Utah. And they've even made up about 40 to 50% of our emissions. And beyond educating the public about clean air through things like anti-idling campaigns and other outreach, we've prioritized action at the state legislature when it comes to vehicle emissions. So, for example, this last session, we were successful in squashing a bill that would have raised the registration fee for electric vehicles from anywhere from 150% to 400% higher than they currently are. And this bill would have made these registration fees actually the highest in the country and would have created a significant barrier for most individuals who maybe even right now struggle to afford clean cars and other electric vehicles. But while we celebrated stopping this bad bill, thanks to folks like yourselves who are tuning in today and who raised their voices to help us stop it, the question over electric vehicles is really just beginning. The argument over raising the rates related to electric vehicles was that they, quote, aren't paying their fair share of road maintenance because they don't pay taxes, like gas taxes, unquote. And this summer, the Utah Department of Transportation, or perhaps this fall, will actually be releasing their first ever report on what's called the Road Usage Charge Program, which this is an optional program that electric vehicle drivers can take part in. And it charges them essentially for miles traveled to somewhat replace lost revenue from gas tax that they traditionally aren't paying if they're fully electric, or only partly paying if there's something like a hybrid vehicle. And finally, the Biden administration is in the process of doing things like reinstating the California Clean Cars waiver, among other actions, executive actions that we expect on electric vehicles, which HEAL will continue to take part in and push and have a voice in at the federal level. So this is all to say that, all of this work is really ramping up. Just because one bad bill gets stopped does not mean it will just go away forever. So this is an ongoing priority for us to ensure that citizens have access to affordable and equitable access to clean cars. And quickly, we also believe, of course, that better public transit will help clean up our air. We've supported and continue to support not just ongoing funding for expanded and even cleaner public transit, but also we're trying to push for better and more regular access so more people can ride and actually have a chance to experience the alternative transportation and get their cars off the road. Any car trip saved is emissions saved. And finally, on vehicle emissions, we're always prioritizing better options for diesel emissions, which are a significant contributor as well. And not just vehicles, a truck you see on the road, but it's also diesel emissions that don't drive on the road. So that's things like trains or construction equipment. We collaborate with national organizations such as the Diesel Technology Forum and their members to try and better understand this industry as a whole, and to push for a program where old, dirty engines can be replaced with newer ones, which can really be, especially for these really, really large diesel engines, an expensive process. And that's compounded with the fact that, these engines last forever. They're out on the roads or on construction sites for a really long time. And so we've been focusing how we can also pressure industries like Union Pacific, for example, to take initiative in actually updating their own dirty engines, whether it be through, again, various incentive programs or regulatory programs as well. And we can pass it off to Noah.
Thank you so much. Good work. I am going to cover our state implementation plans, of which we have a couple going on. So when an area is out of what we call attainment, which means that we're not meeting federal ambient air quality standards, those areas are known as non-attainment for air quality. When an area reaches non-attainment designation, of which there are various levels, then the state is charged with developing what's known as a state implementation plan, what we just call a SIP. They have to create this SIP to demonstrate tangible steps to reduce emissions to a satisfactory level to achieve attainment. And then the EPA must approve this plan. And it's basically creating a window in which we reduce precursor emissions that will, by the end, reduce the amount of of poor air quality days in the non-attainment areas. So it's sort of a roundabout process that occurs at the state level and is enforced at the federal level. And we have a couple of SIP processes going on that we're going to talk about here in the Wasatch Front. The first, we have a Wasatch Front particulate matter 2.5, so PM 2.5 SIP. And as we touched on earlier, fine particulate matter is an air pollutant. It's a concern for people's health when the levels in the air are high. PM 2.5 are these really tiny little particles in the air. They reduce visibility and they cause the air to appear hazy, like when we saw a couple of photos ago. Outdoor PM 2.5 levels are most likely to be elevated on days with little or no wind mixing. And that's really evident during our winter inversion events. In urban areas like the Wasatch Front, these fine particulate particles originate from cars, trucks, buses, tailpipes of all different types of vehicles, like Grace mentioned, and other operations that involve burning fossil fuels like wood or oil for heating. And we have less of that on the Wasatch Front than we used to, but we still have a lot. Or burning coal or natural resources such as forests and grass fires. And these things can happen locally, but once these particles form from the reaction of gases or droplets in the atmosphere, they can travel far distance from their origins, like power plants. So in late 2020, the EPA determined that the Wasatch Front is going to meet attainment for PM 2.5, but groups like HEAL, we weren't quite over the moon with that designation, as Salt Lake's airshed still has an unacceptable pollution load. And going out there and saying that we've reached attainment is like going out there and saying that our air is good now, which we know is not the case on many days. And in addition to the unacceptable pollution load, we have more industrial emission sources and population growth on the way. Scott mentioned just one new development that could have a huge impact on our airshed, but there's a lot of smaller developments that are occurring concurrently that are going to create a real test for our air quality efforts over the few years. So we also know that this redesignation doesn't consider the disproportionate impact air pollution has on certain communities in Utah, and Grace touched on that earlier. So on our end, we're going to make sure that the DEQ is being thorough in their assessment and analysis of the situation, and they're not submitting to political pressures, whether that comes from the state or business interests. And we'll continue to pressure the state regulators and legislators to keep the foot on the gas, so to speak, on addressing air quality concerns on the Wasatch Front as they relate to PM 2.5. And in addition to this state implementation plan, the Wasatch Front also has a ozone state implementation plan. So we get high levels of ozone on the Wasatch Front. A lot of people think it's just a rural Utah problem, but ozone in the air we breathe can harm our health, especially on those hot, sunny days when the ozone can reach unhealthy levels, and even relatively low levels of ozone can cause health effects. So ozone is a colorless gas. It's an invisible gas, and it's not emitted directly into the air as a gas, but it's formed through a chemical reaction between nitrous oxides and volatile or organic compounds in the presence of sunlight. So that's the reason it can happen here on the Wasatch Front with our various pollution sources, or in rural Utah where there's not necessarily the same sources. So while the same ozone molecule protects the Earth from harmful radiation, at ground level, it's a harmful air pollutant. And exposure causes respiratory inflammation, irritation, and like Grace mentioned earlier, it can be a sunburn on the lungs. So major sources include transportation emissions, industrial facilities, household products and cleaning supplies, and then oil and gas exploration. That's more the Uinta Basin rather than what we have here on the Wasatch Front. So in June of 2018, the EPA designated the Wasatch Front as marginal non-attainment, which is the least stringent non-attainment designation. But that means we're required to attain the ozone standard by August 3rd, 2021. So those keeping score at home realize that's just a few weeks away. And recent monitoring data indicates that the northern Wasatch Front non-attainment area will not attain the ozone standard by that date, and will be bumped up to moderate classification in early 2022. So that's a process that we're monitoring closely. And again, as with the PM 2.5 SIP, we want the designation and the policy to reflect the situation of Utahns on the ground. And I would love to mention something that's going on concurrently with this non-attainment designation process. So there's an effort from the Utah Mining Association and the Utah Petroleum Association to push the Department of Air Quality, who are state regulators, and then the EPA to apply for what's known as a 179B waiver. And this is a part of the Clean Air Act that accounts for international transportation of air pollutants. Importantly, Congress designated 179B for use in very limited circumstances where an area was failing to attain because of emissions from immediate adjacent areas in a foreign country. So for an example, imagine your air quality planning for Southwest Texas for that airshed. You would calculate the contributions from the heavily populated and industrial side in Mexico, like the Juarez area. You would calculate that, and that's reasonable. But what we have here is an effort to prove that Utah would be in attainment for ozone if not for the international emissions from areas like East Asia. So in a preliminary review, the DAQ found that while international emissions are likely to have an impact on Utah ozone measurements, differences between ozone exceedance and non-exceedance days are not correlated with changes in international emissions. So this means that the DAQ pretty much already knows that they won't be able to identify potential days in the non-attainment area impacted by internationally transported ozone. So to break all that down on the political side, we basically have industries pushing for a waiver not grounded in science for their own benefit and at the expense of our health. So we find it troubling that the DEQ hasn't pushed back on this harder, but they're a regulatory agency and they're being lobbied pretty hard in a way that necessitates a response from organizations like HEAL. So we're going to continue to oppose this process on both a technical and political basis. And we'll keep you up to date on that. And we do have a Uinta Basin ozone non-attainment area and a SIP, but I'll let Grace go over that one in a little bit. And that's it for me. Thank you.
So I think, Turner, you're next.
Yes, so the reason that we're doing these campaign briefings, HEAL has been chosen by the AHECI Trust to receive a matching grant. And so as of today, we're just under a third of the way to receiving this matching grant. And everything that we've been talking about so far contributes to HEAL's capacity. So we receive requests almost every day for HEAL to be involved in just a myriad of issues. And this capacity campaign fundamentally is about growing our ability to address air quality in areas that we can't currently engage in because of the small staff that we have and because of our own capacity. So we're asking if you have the capacity to support our capacity campaign, that you make a donation and help us reach the next level. As my colleagues are going to talk about shortly, there are a number of campaigns that we currently don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to address. And fundamentally, that is what we're raising funding for. So with that, I'll let my colleagues continue to talk about the campaigns that we're hoping to expand into with the capacity campaign.
Great, thanks, Turner. So one area that we would like to be able to spend more time working on, but just don't have the bandwidth to do, is working on the emissions that contribute to our air quality problems that come from buildings. So Grace mentioned that buildings are about to surpass vehicles in their contribution to our particulate pollution. And that's because vehicles, the technology is getting cleaner. The fuel we put in our cars is getting cleaner. People are aware of how their cars are contributing to air quality problems and in some cases changing their behavior. But most of us are not that aware of how the houses we live in and the office buildings where we work also contribute to air pollution. And it starts with the creation of building materials. So making cement and transporting materials to the area where the building is occurring are all part of the generation of different types of air pollutants. And then once the building is built, if you have a gas water heater, or if we have a gas stove or oven, it results in gas emissions going out of the flues of our houses. And as the Wasatch Front continues to grow, and the houses are getting bigger, and there's more appliances, more heating needed during the winter, our buildings are slowly getting to the point where they're becoming the largest single sort of group of sources of air pollution. Not only do they affect outdoor air pollution, but they also create indoor air pollution. So this is something that can be addressed in a number of ways. One is by changing the building codes. And one thing we were able to be involved in a couple of years ago at the legislature is a requirement that any new buildings that had a water heater over, I believe it was a 50-gallon capacity, needed to install a low NOx water heater. These are a special type of gas water heaters that have emission controls on them. They are more expensive, but it was the first attempt at trying to put some limits around how buildings can emit particulate matter in particular. And even though the water heater is low NOx, NOx can react with other things in the atmosphere to create particulates. So it's a precursor of particulate pollution. The other thing that is being pushed is electrification. So even though most of our electricity right now comes from fossil fuel power plants, so specifically coal, as those move toward retirement and more of that is replaced by renewables, having an electric water heater or an electric stove and oven is going to be much cleaner than having those appliances powered by gas. There are actually efforts in the state to prohibit municipalities from denying permits to run gas lines into new development areas. That's something a bill that showed up at the legislature last session. It didn't pass, but we are hopeful that we can keep that from going forward. And then what we're trying to do is promote models of electrification in areas like the new development at the point of the mountain where the old prison site is, to have that be completely electrified so there is no natural gas involved in that development. There are forces, as you would imagine, that are resisting that. And one of the things that the natural gas industry is doing is trying to rebrand themselves as clean energy. The truth is natural gas does produce about 50% of the amount of carbon dioxide that coal does, but it's still significant. And along the fuel chain, along the production cycle of natural gas, there's a lot of leakage of both gas and methane is a far more powerful climate change greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide than coal is. So you'll hear terms like clean natural gas or natural gas with carbon capture or renewable natural gas. And all those are marketing efforts to try to prop up the natural gas industry so it doesn't get targeted as one of the fossil fuel sources of power that needs to be reduced and eliminated in order to improve our air. So there is a process going on to revise the building codes. It's a fairly intensive process. There's lots of committees, there's lots of technical information that's going to be going on during the next year, and there will be bills at the legislature to adopt new building code standards. And HEAL would like to be significantly involved in those discussions, but right now we just don't have the ability to be in those meetings and be part of that process. So that's just one example of an under-resourced clean air campaign that this capacity campaign that Turner talked about would allow us to become involved in. Next slide.
Thanks, Scott. So as Noah mentioned earlier, the state implementation plan, also for short, we just call it the SIP. This is that regulatory process under the Clean Air Act when regions far exceed federal air quality standards. Um, some of this, if you tuned in last week to our energy and climate presentation, which you can also find on our YouTube page, which is HEAL Utah videos, some of this might sound familiar because there is a little bit of overlap with that work. So while we've been able to give significant focus to the SIPs along the Wasatch Front, there are still air quality problems happening throughout the rest of Utah that, if we had the capacity and bandwidth, we would love to really focus on these as well. So one of these is a SIP within the Uinta Basin. Again, discussed a little bit about the Uinta Basin last week. Noah mentioned it when he was talking about the SIP today. But the Uinta Basin is out of attainment for ozone pollution due to the oil and gas activity there. While the Wasatch Front SIPs are pretty complex, in one of the comment periods that we were able to get some expert consultants to help us out with, we had about 3,000 pages of technical comments that we submitted to it. But the Uinta Basin ones are just as complicated, if not more so. So with an increased ability to consult technical and subject matter experts, which we, really need to fully grasp how complex areas like the Uinta Basin are and their air quality standards and exceedances, as well as the ability to organize locally in the area, which we really haven't been able to do yet because most of us are located here along the Wasatch Front at HEAL. We can increase our involvement in this regulatory process that's really invaluable to not just ensuring cleaner air, but making sure that we're actually meeting federal standards that are in place to protect public health and our environment. And just overarchingly, at the core of all of this, we have to keep in mind is that there are communities and Utahns breathing in this pollution every single day. And so by taking part in processes like the SIP, we can help ensure a healthier future for the residents who are breathing this ozone day in and day out. And also last week, we briefly discussed regional haze, which is another form of pollution. This one is caused by coal plants in southern Utah and actually impacts all of our national parks in the southern part of the state and obviously the surrounding communities. Increased capacity to work on regional haze would be similar to working on the Uinta Basin SIP in the sense of requiring more technical expertise and understanding into this heavily regulatory process at the state and federal level, but also significantly more bandwidth to actually organize in the local communities impacted by this pollution, which can range from, having meetings, listening meetings to understand local concerns, to help connect with local businesses, to help get people involved in actually testifying during public comment periods. Because for a lot of this, it's fantastic if we can get anyone to come give public comment. But if all of the folks who are giving public comment in the Uinta Basin or regional haze in southern Utah are from the Wasatch Front, that's not nearly as effective as people who are actually living in the areas coming forward and saying they want to see change and they expect regulators to hold the different industries who are causing this type of pollution accountable. And next slide, please, Maysay.
Great. I am going to pivot towards an issue that we've been working on behind the scenes for a couple of years, and we've done some more public-facing work with some of our partners over at the Sierra Club and Western Resource Advocates. So what you see in this picture is dust being kicked up from an open pit, and that may be a familiar sight if you live on the Wasatch Front, particularly on one of the east or west benches. So in these communities already burdened by poor air quality, wind-blown dust takes on additional toll on public health. So for those living in the neighborhoods that I mentioned, which are frequently near gravel pits, exposure to this dust being kicked up by a breeze or by trucks rolling over them can exacerbate health concerns like asthma and increase other health risks. So we have dozens of open gravel pits along the Wasatch Front that kick up this dust. The dust blowing off the gravel pits and other open sources is called fugitive dust. So imagine that dust in an old wanted ad with those little things over its eyes behind bars. It's fugitive dust, and it's wanted by HEAL. So Utah has regulations because this does pose a serious public health threat, but Utah's existing regulations are really ineffective. Other arid states like Utah have adopted practical solutions to control the fugitive dust, but Utah has thus far refused to update its approach and protect its neighborhoods. There's really nothing but excuses going on at the state level while our communities suffer from this. So like I mentioned, we've been working with partners to advocate for some reasonable solutions. And we had hoped to run legislation in 2021, but COVID and capacity related concerns sort of zapped the momentum there. But where we are and what we we have some real policy solutions. We have a couple of champions at the legislature, and we have grassroots support in these communities to help push this forward. And we're really going to need all of these things if we want to address fugitive dust. A couple of the recommendations for controlling this include increasing meaningful monitoring and enforceability to protect communities adjacent to the mining. Currently, there's a Utah law that allows gravel pits to apply water to reduce dust, and that's a really insufficient and temporary remedy. It's really ineffective. They don't have to apply that water at night or if the facility is not in operation, and we know that this dust being kicked up doesn't really care if it's in operation or not. And gravel pits often have large areas of disturbed ground prone to wind erosion and therefore create dust. So when it is hot and breezy, it's almost impossible for an operator to apply enough water frequently to enough to cover its multiple acre facility to control that dust adequately. Another area to address is opacity laws as enforceability, that enforceability sort of misses the mark because it can't be enforced at night or other times when light is poor. So we know where the weak points are, we know where we can address it. But because these decision makers have been reluctant to adopt these and other solutions, we're hoping to respond by documenting at a real community level the severity of the problem, in addition to providing reasonable solutions and bringing impacted communities into this process. So hopefully by bolstering those three areas and with additional resources, we'll be able to push this towards the finish line within the next legislative session or two, and finally come around and start being able to address these fugitive dusts. And that's it for fugitive dust.
So Turner, I think we're back to you, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Yeah, so we just wanted to make one final note. If you are able to support the capacity campaign, you can do so online at healutah.org/give. You can also mail a check to HEAL Utah. If you have any questions about the capacity campaign or would like additional information, my contact information is here on the slide. We'd like to thank you for your past support of HEAL Utah and ask for your future support as we try to grow and increase our capacity. So thank you so much for tuning in today.
Great. And with that, I think we'll open things up to see if there's any questions from those who are listening out there in the cyber world. We'll give that just a minute because sometimes it takes a sec for people to type things in.
I can start off with some Instagram questions that we got during, like, beforehand. If I can start off with those.
Sure.
So one of the questions from our Instagram is, what is the effect of Utah's population growth with air quality and how that's going to relate to the policy work that we're doing?
Noah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll start us off, and there's lots of area to bolster, so if either of you want to jump in. So what's interesting, as Utah's population has, especially on the Wasatch Front, has increased over the past decade and a half, we've seen a lot of pollution levels level off and even go down. And that's because the individual footprint for emissions for each person has gone down dramatically for a few different reasons, including more efficient vehicles, more efficient appliances at home, and things that are affected both by personal consumption decisions and also by policies that make those things easier. So it's really interesting to see that we've been able to keep our emissions under control while the population has grown. But that's something that's really tenuous and can be undone if we go the wrong path on some of these future development projects. And it also requires continued work. It's not going to go down forever just because it's gone down per capita over the past few years. It means staying up to date with building codes, making sure that tier 3 fuels and electric vehicle infrastructure is out there, and making sure that we are allowing for affordable appliances to reduce those individual levels. And it requires diligent planning at the community and state level moving forward. So it's sort of been an interesting thing to watch, and it has a few different lessons for policymaking going forward.
And one thing I just add to that is that we may be in a little bit of what I'd call a luck window, because we haven't really had a serious prolonged inversion now for 2 or 3, 4 years as the population's been growing. So we don't really know exactly how much worse the inversion generated pollution would be if we had one of those prolonged inversions. For anyone who's lived here for a while, you remember that we've had sometimes up to 2 weeks of inversion where the air just gets worse and worse and worse, and that hasn't happened for a while. So it creates the appearance that the air is getting better when it's really just the weather has allowed us to sort of dodge that kind of problem. And then the second sort of natural, well, actually not natural, the second influence on that is wildfires. And we've had a lot of wildfire pollution in Utah over the last few years, but the EPA does not count wildfire pollution against our compliance, our attainment. So our lungs count it, but the EPA doesn't. And so we need to think of our air quality in a more sort of comprehensive way than just the way the EPA thinks of it. Also, the EPA is a little bit, well, more than a little bit behind in terms of the thresholds that they established for healthy air. Their levels are behind the science, in that there's now good science that exposure to air pollution at lower levels than the air that the EPA says are healthy has now been shown to create health problems.
Awesome. I have another question from Instagram. This one is, what helps clean the air besides shutting down polluting industries?
Scott, you're on mute.
Grace, why don't you start?
Yeah, so that's a great question and something we get asked pretty often. I mean, like the question stated, it's definitely not a one size fits all. Places like industry, they definitely need to do their part, as do businesses. But as individuals, we can all do things as well. It's important to keep in mind, though, one, there's no such thing as a perfect environmentalist. So just because you're not doing all of these things does not mean you're a bad person or anything like that. But you can do small things in your everyday life that can help clean up our air. Whether it's, and again, that we're, a lot of us hopefully being vaccinated, you can start carpooling again. And that's a great way to be saving trips. You can do things which is called trip chaining, which is essentially, if you have errands to run, do them all in a row, because that will actually save your engine from getting cold and turning on the car while the engine's cold, which is a large burst of emissions. So just do them all in a row on a Saturday. If you have the accessibility and ability to bike places or perhaps walk, that's also great and is what's known as alternative transportation. I do want to do a quick pitch that tomorrow night HEAL is having a people-powered pub crawl, actually, speaking of alternative transportation. Folks from HEAL will be walking, biking. I think our grassroots organizer might be rollerblading to a couple different pubs, and you can find that on our website and our social media. But also what's really important besides that individual action is raising your voice, because not only do we need to hold ourselves accountable and hold industry accountable, but we need to hold our lawmakers accountable. In the end, they are going to be the ones who are funding different projects that will help with all of the things I just mentioned, and ensuring that they're actually, putting the money where their mouth is. They're not just talking the talk, but walking the walk on actually taking action to improve our air quality and ensure that everybody's doing their part is really important. So definitely a lot of fronts that we can take on our air quality. And Scott and Noah, Turner, may say, feel free to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I think that was really good. And the only thing I would add, which Grace was alluding to towards the end, it's, a lot of this isn't possible just by individual actions alone. Individual actions collectively do add up, but we see rhetoric out there that works to shield big polluters by putting the onus of behavior on the individual. So to an extent, individual actions are important, but there is a limit to what they can do. And that demonstrates the need to continue to pressure lawmakers and to pass good policies and to hold big polluters accountable. If there's an oil company that's really excited that you're taking the bus, that's fine, but it's okay. It's okay to also demand more of those big polluters. And I think that's what we're trying to walk the line on.
Any other questions, Macy?
Those are the only questions we got on Instagram.
Okay. Well, we're just a couple of minutes before the end of the session. So I think we'll just go ahead and wrap things up. This is the final session. As I said, Macy, where can folks find the YouTube links to the other sessions and to eventually to this one once you get it posted?
They can find them all on our YouTube channel. I'll actually drop a link right now in our chat so you guys can find the playlist with all of these on there as well.
Looks like Grace beat you to it. So that link is in there. And then we're always happy to answer questions from people offline. If you want to call us at our office or email us at info@healutah.org. And as Turner has been saying, we'll be conducting our capacity fundraising campaign between now and August 15th. If we are able to raise the money to get the match, we will hire another policy associate to work on some of these issues that we've been talking about. And we'll also be able to pay some consultants to help make sure that our positions are based on good evidence and science. And we'll be able to do more to get messages out to those who have the ability to influence policy with their legislators or their city council people or their federal delegation members. So this could go a long way to help us do this work. We appreciate your support. HEAL has been supported by our donors for 20 years now. That's why we still exist. That's why we're going strong. We can't say enough to thank people for that. And we hope you will acknowledge that we can do more if we have more resources to do it with and help us out. So I think with that, we'll sign off and everybody have a good weekend. And don't forget to join our pub crawl tomorrow night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.